After 10 years of silence, not complete silence, but the kind that hums around an empty house, steady and unforgiving, I had stopped expecting life to surprise me. I lived in patterns. I woke, brewed tea, read the paper, and tended to my modest garden with the same devotion some women reserved for church or lovers. It wasn't loneliness exactly. I had friends, a dog-eared library card, and enough hobbies to keep my mind occupied. But there was a hollowness I didn't speak of, even to myself. Then one gray Friday the front door creaked open and there he was. Liam. My son. 23 now, broad-shouldered and sun-kissed from too many days out jogging, with that smile, the one he'd inherited from his father, tilted slightly to one side like a secret. "Mom," he said, eyes lighting up as he stepped through the threshold like he belonged there, like the years since college hadn't turned our lives into separate circles that only overlapped at holidays. I didn't even have a chance to ask why he was there before he held out the envelope. "2 tickets," he announced. "To the Maldives." My brain fumbled for reason. The Maldives. Blue water, white sand, hammocks and all that. He grinned. "And we leave in a week." I stared at him. At the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap. At the man who now towered over me with this wild idea in hand. "Why?" I asked, half laughing, half in awe. He didn't hesitate. "Because you deserve it." I don't remember saying yes. I just remember standing at the edge of the jet bridge, blinking at the horizon, his hand steady on my back. The Maldives was unreal. Our bungalow stood on stilts above impossibly clear water. Every morning, I woke to the sound of waves lapping against wood and the sun pouring through gauzy curtains like gold dust. We snorkeled through coral gardens, floated beside sea turtles, and dined on white sand lit only by lanterns and starlight. And I laughed, truly laughed for the first time in years. Liam was the kind of companion I didn't know I needed. Gentle, patient, observant. He pulled me back to life with each playful shove into the ocean, each quiet conversation beneath the stars. It wasn't just a vacation. It was a rediscovery, not just of place but of myself. One night, as the horizon blushed with the last of the sun and we sat on the sandbank surrounded by ocean, he reached for my hand. "I remember you used to sit out on the porch every night," he said. "Just staring into the dark." "I still do," I admitted, surprised at the lump that rose in my throat. "I always wondered," he said, voice softer than the waves, "if you were waiting for someone to come back, or just waiting for something to feel again." His words pierced me. "I guess I was waiting for a reason," I said. "To not just keep going but to feel like myself again." He looked at me then, not as a boy looks at his mother, but as one's soul recognizes another. I hoped this would help. "It did," I whispered. That night, on the balcony, wrapped in blankets with a glass of wine in hand, I watched the moonlight shimmer across Liam's profile and wondered how I had gone so long without seeing him, truly seeing him. The boy I raised had become a man who now held my heart not just as a son, but as the one person who still saw me fully, entirely, without expectation. There was a peace in that. And something else, unspoken, delicate. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. I woke to the sound of soft waves lapping against the stilts of our bungalow, the early light of morning slipping through the cracks of the curtains. For a moment I didn't move. I just lay there listening. The ocean had a way of speaking, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in rhythm, and that morning it felt like it was humming to the pace of something inside me I hadn't felt in years. Liam was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the balcony floor, staring out at the horizon. Shirtless, his shoulders catching the gold of the morning sun. He looked both peaceful and far away, like his thoughts had drifted somewhere the tide couldn't reach. I padded out quietly and sat beside him. Neither of us spoke at first. It wasn't awkward. There was something comforting about the silence between us now. Unspoken understanding that didn't need to be filled. "I didn't want to wake you," he said eventually, turning his head just slightly. "I'm glad you didn't," I murmured. "This is a beautiful way to wake up." He smiled, eyes still trained on the water. I think I could live here forever. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't agree, but because something about the stillness of that morning made my thoughts louder than usual. I looked at him, at the line of his jaw, the softness in his gaze, and realized something that unsettled me in the gentlest way. I liked the way he looked at me, not just with affection or admiration but with something else. Something I couldn't name. Something I wasn't sure I should name. That afternoon we took the kayaks out again. The ocean stretched out in every direction, glowing like liquid glass. I paddled slowly, letting the current tug us wherever it wanted. Liam, ahead of me, glanced back and grinned. "You're slacking." "I'm savoring," I shot back. "There's a difference." We pulled onto a narrow strip of sand shaded by palms, just the two of us, water lapping at our ankles. He dropped down onto the sand and pulled out the small thermos of iced tea we'd packed. As he poured us each a cup, our hands brushed. It was nothing. But it wasn't. He didn't move away quickly, and neither did I. Our eyes met, and in that moment I could feel it. Pull. The question neither of us dared voice. We sipped in silence after that, both pretending not to notice how still we'd gone. "Do you ever think," he said suddenly, "that life gives you these moments just to test you?" I looked over, startled. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Like moments where everything feels perfect but also like it's hanging by a thread. And you don't know if you're supposed to grab onto it or let it pass." My breath caught. "Yes," I said quietly. "All the time." His gaze lingered on mine. "I don't want this to pass." I didn't answer. Couldn't. Instead I looked away, watching the sky change color as the sun began its descent once again. Gold turned to amber. The day softened into something intimate and uncertain. That evening something changed. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. After dinner, we walked barefoot along the boardwalk back to our bungalow. The lanterns flickered, casting shadows on the wooden planks. I could feel the warmth of his arm beside mine, not touching, but close enough to imagine what it would feel like if it did. When we reached the door, I turned to say something. Anything to cut through the tension. But before I could, Liam reached out gently, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "Sorry," he said, his voice low. "I shouldn't. I just—" "It's okay," I whispered. And it was. Somehow, impossibly, it was okay. But as I lay in bed that night, the moonlight casting soft lines across the ceiling, I knew things couldn't stay untouched much longer. Something inside me had shifted, like a tide turning quietly in the dark. We were no longer just mother and son. We were something more. And that terrified me. But it also made me feel alive. The air felt different the next morning. It wasn't the breeze. It was something in the silence between us, something that hummed like a low tide, steady and full of meaning. Liam was already in the kitchen area of the bungalow, barefoot, shirtless, making coffee with a concentration that was almost comical for such a simple task. I watched him for a moment from the hallway, unseen, letting the warmth of that moment sink into me. He had grown into his body in a way I hadn't really noticed until now. Not just taller or stronger, but settled, confident, soft in the places that mattered and strong where it counted. And more than anything, there was a kindness in him, a warmth that made the space around him feel like home. "Morning," I said finally, stepping into the room. He turned and smiled. "You slept in. You wore me out yesterday." He raised an eyebrow. "All I did was drag you across a lagoon and make you eat 3 helpings of grilled mango fish. That's hardly exhausting." "You don't know my limits," I teased. His grin softened, eyes lingering just a second too long. "No," he said, quieter. "Maybe I don't." I felt the words settle in the air between us, warm and uncertain. We spent the morning in the hammock outside, swaying above the shallow water as it shimmered in the sunlight. Liam read, one arm slung casually behind his head, the other resting on the curve of my foot where it brushed his leg. I should have moved it. I didn't. Neither did he. Every so often his thumb would shift, just slightly. A soft press of skin. like a question or maybe just an answer neither of us wanted to speak aloud. Later we returned to the beach, a small, quiet cove only accessible by foot. The sand was untouched, the breeze gentler here. Felt like the kind of place where time slowed down just to let people breathe. We laid our towels side by side and stretched out, the sun warming every part of me that had been cold for far too long. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of his breathing beside me. Steady, calm, close. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said, meaning it. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Do you ever think about who you are now? Not just as my mom but as a person. Like when no one's looking?" I turned my head to look at him. His expression was open, honest, like the boy who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares, asking if monsters were real, trusting me to tell the truth. "I think about that all the time," I said. "Lately more than ever." He nodded slowly. "I think about who you are too." The air caught in my throat. "Liam." He reached over, his hand finding mine in the space between our towels. Simple touch. No pressure. Just presence. "I don't know what this is," he said softly. "But I feel closer to you than I've felt to anyone in my life." My heart pounded, not from fear but from the sudden clarity of it. The truth I hadn't wanted to name. The bond that had grown in the quiet spaces between laughter and shared meals and moonlit walks. I squeezed his hand. Just once. And that was enough. Now. That night we didn't go out. We stayed on the balcony, the sky an endless ocean of stars, the waves below whispering like they held secrets only we could understand. We shared a bottle of wine, passing it between us, laughing over nothing and everything. I was tipsy by the time I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. "I don't want to leave," I said half to myself. "Then don't," he said. Open my eyes. He was watching me again, with that expression I couldn't name. Not lust, not love. Something more complicated. More dangerous. More real. "You're staring." He didn't flinch. "You're beautiful when you're quiet." The words hit me like a wave. Gentle, unexpected, and overwhelming. I looked away, breath caught in my chest. "You can't say things like that," I whispered. "Why not?" His voice was low, steady. "It's true. Because I'm you're you," he interrupted, firm but kind. "And that's who I see." The silence that followed was heavy but not suffocating. He stood, crossed the space between us, and knelt beside my chair. Slowly, without touching me, he looked into my eyes. "I know we can't go back to what this was before," he said. "But maybe we don't have to be afraid of what it's becoming." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I leaned forward, rested my forehead against his, and closed my eyes. And there we stayed. No words, no plans, no promises. Just the ocean, the stars, and the quiet shift of something that felt too big to stop. The sky was painted in shadows and silver. The moon hung heavy above the water, casting its reflection in ripples that stretched all the way to the horizon. The night had that stillness only the ocean could offer. Vast, humming, sacred. We hadn't spoken much since the balcony. Not because we didn't want to, but because words had become too small for what was growing between us. Liam had suggested a walk. "Just a short one," he'd said, voice soft as he held out his hand. Took it. We walked barefoot along the shoreline, waves curling over our toes, cool sand shifting beneath our steps. The resort's lights faded behind us until there was only moonlight and water. I could hear his breath beside me. I could feel his presence in the way the night air wrapped around us, close, careful, trembling with unspoken weight. He didn't let go of my hand. I didn't pull away. "I don't know what this is," I said finally, breaking the silence as we paused near a cluster of driftwood. "But I've never felt it before. Not like this." Liam turned toward me. His eyes found mine, unflinching. "I have," he said. "With you." He stepped closer. The air between us was warm and alive, like the space before lightning strikes, a pause before something permanent. "I know it's wrong," I whispered. "Is it?" he asked gently, searching my face. Or are we just afraid to admit that something beautiful doesn't always fit inside the boxes we were given? I didn't know how to answer. So I didn't. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not my son, not the boy I had raised, but the man who had quietly rebuilt me over the past few days. Who had reminded me that I was more than someone's mother. More than a caretaker. More than someone who had to put herself second all the time. His hand moved to my cheek, tentative, reverent. I didn't flinch. And when he leaned in, slow and sure and quiet as a wave, I met him halfway. Our lips touched, soft, trembling, asking permission we'd already given one another. It wasn't hungry. It wasn't fast. It was a question. Revelation. A confession neither of us could put into words. When we parted, he rested his forehead against mine. "I'm not sorry," he whispered. I closed my eyes, heart pounding. "Neither am I." We stood like that in the dark, the sea rushing at our feet as if to carry the moment away. But it didn't. Stayed. It soaked into me like salt water, leaving something new behind. Eventually we walked back. Slowly, silently, fingers interlaced. That night I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because I couldn't stop remembering the feeling of his lips on mine. The way he had looked at me like I was someone worth choosing. And for the first time in years I didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a beginning. Coming home felt like waking from a dream you never wanted to end. The air was colder. The light grayer. The silence, different. No longer soft and wistful, but sharp, full of echoes we couldn't ignore. Liam wheeled our suitcases into the living room while I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the framed photos on the wall. My old life stared back at me. Family portraits, birthday smiles, the past arranged like a museum display. A life that had once felt enough. Now it felt too small for what we had shared. "I'll unpack later," Liam said, his voice gentler than usual. He nodded. Neither of us mentioned the walk. A kiss. The electricity that still buzzed between us every time our eyes met. But it was there. In the quiet pauses between footsteps. In the way his hand brushed mine when we passed each other in the hallway. In the way my breath caught when he smiled at me from across the kitchen. Everything had changed. And yet nothing had. He stayed longer than expected. A day turned into a week. And I didn't ask him why. Maybe I was afraid of what he'd say. Or what he wouldn't. We settled into a new kind of rhythm. Familiar yet changed. We cooked together. We watched films in the evenings. Sometimes we talked about the trip, about the coral reefs or the food or the sea that never seemed to stop singing. But we never talked about that night. Until one morning, he walked into the kitchen, barefoot and sleepy-eyed, and found me standing by the sink, lost in thought. He came up behind me, slid his arms gently around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder. "I can't stop thinking about it," he whispered. I didn't move. "I know. I don't want it to disappear." It didn't. He turned me slowly to face him, his hands still resting lightly on my hips. His eyes searched mine, not with desperation, but with a steady sort of reverence. "I don't want to lose this," he said. "I don't either," I admitted. "But I don't know what this is yet. Or what it can be." His thumb brushed the back of my hand. "All I know is I don't want to go back to how things were." I swallowed. "We can't." "Then let's go forward." That evening we took a walk through the neighborhood. Just like always. Side by side, hands in our pockets. Silence draped comfortably between us. But I kept feeling it. His presence beside me like gravity. When we reached the edge of the small park near the old library, he paused beneath the street lamp and looked at me with a quiet, impossible tenderness. "Does it scare you?" he asked. "Yes," I said honestly. "But not because I regret it." His face softened. "Me neither." And then there, in the most ordinary corner of our quiet little world, he reached for my hand. No words. No rush. Just the warmth of skin, the soft grip of fingers that knew where they belonged. I laced mine through his, holding tightly. Letting go had never even occurred to me.